Some shadows die with the man, but others linger long after his fall. It begins with a velvet box left at Baker Street, holding a ring engraved with Moriarty's mark, a token that should have perished with him at Reichenbach, yet gleams with a warning that the game never ended. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. The hour is late, the fog is thick, and the trail of the professor's shadow lies before us. Let us follow it together. It was on one of those nights when London seemed to groan under the weight of its own history. A storm rolled across the city with a violence that rattled every shutter and shook the very stones of Baker Street. The rain lashed against the windows with relentless fury, and the gas lamps flickered weakly, swallowed by the fog that crept low upon the streets. I sat in my customary chair opposite Sherlock Holmes, whose gaunt figure was outlined against the glow of the fire. He had been silent for hours, save for the occasional scrape of his violin bow across the strings, producing not music, but a low, mournful drone that suited the night's oppressive temper. His keen eyes, half-lidded, were fixed on the shifting flames, as though in them he divined some hidden cipher. I confess that the weather, coupled with my friend's silence, had driven me into a state of brooding unease. Outside, the thunder broke in a shattering roar, shaking the panes, and I could not rid myself of the sense that the storm carried with it some dark omen. Holmes, however, appeared absorbed, aloof from the elements, as though the heavens themselves could thunder and he would remain untouched by their tumult. It was then, as the hour drew close upon midnight, that the foreboding in my breast was made manifest. A violent rapping at the street door broke the stillness of the room, startling me from my reverie. Holmes, without stirring, allowed a faint smile to creep across his lips. "Mark it, Watson," he murmured in his cold, precise manner. "The storm does not howl without purpose this evening." Mrs. Hudson ushered in a figure so drenched and dishevelled that at first I scarce took him for a man at all, but rather some phantom cast ashore from the tempest outside. His cloak hung in sodden folds, his hair plastered to his forehead, and his trembling hands clutched a small object swaddled in velvet. His eyes darted wildly about the room until they fixed upon Holmes with the desperate focus of one who sees his only hope. "For you, sir, only you," he stammered, thrusting forward the parcel as though it seared his flesh. His voice was hoarse with rain and fear alike. Holmes rose with a composure that made the man's terror appear all the more grotesque. He took the object delicately, as though receiving a sacred relic, and set it upon the table. Without once glancing at the messenger, he said quietly, "That will be all. You may go." The man gave a strangled gasp of relief, turned, and fled into the night. The door slammed in his wake, and the storm seemed to swallow him whole. I turned to Holmes in astonishment. "What in heaven's name?" I began. He silenced me with a gesture. His long, nervous fingers drew back the folds of velvet, revealing a small box of blackened wood, no larger than a man's palm. The hinges were corroded with age, the lock crudely broken. A faint scent of damp clung to it, as though it had lain buried in some dark and forgotten place. Holmes's eyes gleamed with an intensity I had seldom seen, even in our most perilous adventures. "Watson," he said in a tone that brooked no interruption, "observe closely. We are about to be confronted by a shadow I had long believed extinguished at Reichenbach." He pressed the catch, and the lid sprang open with a dull creak. Inside, upon a cushion of faded silk, lay a ring of gold. Its surface was scratched by years, yet it glinted defiantly in the lamplight. I leaned forward and my breath caught in my throat, for engraved upon the inner band, unmistakable in its cruel precision, were the letters J.M. "Moriarty," I whispered, recoiling as though the metal itself burned. Holmes inclined his head, the ghost of a smile flickering across his lips. "The very same, Watson. This ring was thought to have been lost with its owner in the plunge at Reichenbach Falls. And yet, Here it lies before us." Even as he spoke, I saw that the ring was not alone in the box. Tucked beside it was a scrap of paper, folded thrice and yellowed at the edges. Holmes drew it forth and unfolded it with steady hands. Upon it, in a hand I remembered all too well from old case files, was scrawled a single line: "The game never ended." The words seemed to suck the warmth from the room. My mind reeled back to those dreadful days when Holmes and I pursued the professor across Europe, culminating in that final desperate struggle above the abyss. I had seen Moriarty fall with my own eyes. The certainty of his death had been my comfort in many a dark hour. And yet here lay proof that mocked me with its insolence, that his shadow still stalked us. Holmes closed the box with deliberate care and set it upon the mantel. His eyes met mine, and in them I read not fear, but a grim anticipation, as though some long-awaited contest had merely been resumed. "Watson," he said softly, "this storm heralds more than thunder." Holmes lifted the slip of paper between finger and thumb. The ink smeared in places, as though hastily written in some foul corner by a trembling hand. The words, however, were stark in their simplicity, unadorned by flourish, and yet more chilling than any elaborate threat. The game never ended. Holmes read it, but once before folding it neatly and slipping it back into the box. His face had darkened. The lamplight cast sharp shadows across his features, hollowing the eyes and tightening the mouth until I fancied, in a fleeting moment of dread, that it was not my friend who sat before me, but some gaunt spectre of vengeance itself. "Watson," he said gravely, "observe how a single phrase may revive the whole machinery of terror. A game, by its very nature, requires players. And this," he gestured towards the box, "is an invitation, or perhaps a summons." I felt a coldness creep along my spine. "But Moriarty is dead," I said, more to reassure myself than to contradict him. "I saw him with my own eyes fall into that dreadful abyss. You, Holmes, you were nearly pulled after him." "Just so," Holmes murmured, eyes fixed upon the fire. "And yet, here is his ring, here is his hand." He tapped the box. "Whether it be his direct agency or the labour of some disciple matters little. The design is unmistakable. The professor's ghost walks once more through London, and it is no phantom, I assure you, but something of flesh and mind." The words seemed to draw the storm closer. The thunder rolled again, shaking the windows in their frames, and I could not help but glance nervously towards the curtains that swayed with each gust. For a time, there was silence between us, save for the steady drumming of rain upon the panes. Holmes rose suddenly, crossing the room with noiseless tread. With a swift motion, he pulled the curtain aside and stood rigid, his tall frame outlined against the glow of the street lamps outside. I followed his gaze, but the fog hung so thick that the world beyond was but a swirling pall of grey. The occasional flicker of a lantern's flame broke through, then vanished again into the mist. Nothing stirred, and yet Holmes did not move. He remained as still as a statue, his eyes fixed upon some point I could not discern. At length he spoke, his voice low and taut. "We are observed, Watson. Make no sudden motion, but be assured of it. The ring was not delivered without an audience." A strange unease gripped me. I strained my eyes until they ached, but I could perceive nothing in that shrouded void. The gaslight on the opposite side of the street sputtered feebly, illuminating nothing but the falling rain. And yet I trusted Holmes's senses as I trusted few things in this world. If he declared we were watched, then watched we were. "By whom?" I whispered. "That, my dear fellow," he replied, drawing the curtain closed, "is the very question to which we must dedicate ourselves. But whoever lurks yonder has the patience of a predator." His words had scarcely faded when a sound split the night. It came sharp and sudden, a single crack that seemed to tear the very air in two. The glass of the nearest window rattled violently, and I sprang to my feet with an exclamation. Holmes, however, had already dropped to a crouch, his long fingers brushing the sill. He examined the pane with the quick precision of a surgeon probing for a bullet. There, he said, pointing to a faint splintering at the edge of the wood. A shot, aimed not to kill but to warn, or perhaps to terrify. The marksman fires from concealment in the fog, no more than 30 yards distant. Good heavens, Holmes! Then we are under attack. Not we, Watson, he interrupted coolly, rising to his full height. His calmness only heightened the terror that gripped me. Outside, the fog swirled thicker, swallowing all evidence of the unseen assailant. No footsteps retreated, no echo betrayed the direction of flight. The city lay smothered under the storm, indifferent to the menace that had brushed so near. Holmes replaced the curtain with a measured hand and turned back towards me. His face was pale but resolute, the lines of thought cut deep upon his brow. This confirms it, he said. The arrival of the ring was not an idle gesture. Someone has chosen this night to announce himself as the inheritor of Moriarty's cause. And if I read his move correctly, Watson, this is but the opening gambit. The firelight flickered across the black box upon the mantel, and the ring within seemed to glow with a malignant life of its own. Outside, the thunder roared again, as though all London trembled at the whisper that the professor's shadow had returned. The morning after the storm found London wrapped in a damp and lingering fog, one of those heavy mists that cling to the very breath and obscure every street corner with an air of menace. Holmes and I took a hansom down toward the riverside quarter of Limehouse, where the city's pulse beat in a darker rhythm than the respectable thoroughfares of the West End. As we passed through the narrow lanes, the cobbles gleamed slick with rain, and the smell of coal smoke mingled with the stench of brine and tar from the docks. Shadows flitted in the fog, dock workers, vagrants, and men whose eyes gleamed with the quick suspicion of those accustomed to concealment. It was a quarter where whispers of crime clung to the air like soot to the walls. Holmes sat opposite me in the cab, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes closed as though in reverie. Yet I knew from long acquaintance that each sound and movement outside was registering upon his razor-sharp mind. At length, he spoke without opening his eyes. Limehouse, Watson, is a palimpsest of secrets. Every doorway conceals a tale of theft, smuggling, or worse. It is precisely the sort of stage upon which a disciple of Moriarty would choose to rehearse his art. I felt the weight of his words as the cab rattled to a halt before a dim-lit shop bearing the tarnished sign of a jeweller. The constable stationed outside straightened at our approach, his face pale beneath the brim of his helmet. "Gentlemen," he murmured, "you'll find little cheer within." Holmes offered the briefest of nods and stepped across the threshold, and I followed him into the gloom. The air inside was cold, heavy, with the metallic tang of blood that no draught of air could fully disperse. A single lamp burned low upon the counter, casting its light upon a scene of dreadful disorder. Glass cases were shattered, their contents strewn upon the floor. Behind the counter lay the figure of an elderly man, his hands outstretched as though in one last futile defense. I confess I turned away at the sight, for the blood that had soaked his waistcoat left little doubt as to the violence of his end. Holmes, however, bent over the body with a surgeon's detachment, his eyes roving not over the wounds but upon the objects that surrounded him. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "The cases are broken outward, not inward. The hand that slew him sought not jewels for profit, but one specific article." My eyes followed his gesture, and there upon the counter, half buried amid shards of glass, I discerned a small indentation in the dust, the shape of a circle that had once cradled a ring. "The twin of the one sent to Baker Street," I breathed. Holmes inclined his head. "Just so. The professor's shadow lengthens. And note further, no forced entry. Our jeweller opened his door willingly. He knew his visitor." At that moment, the constable cleared his throat uneasily. "Beg pardon, Mr. Holmes, but some of the locals claim they saw a figure last night." "Ah," Holmes said, his gaze sharpening. "Let us hear these whispers." The narrow street outside was crowded with onlookers, their faces pale in the gaslight that still burned despite the hour. Holmes moved among them like a dark flame, his gaze piercing each man and woman in turn. One old woman, her shawl pulled tight about her, clutched at his sleeve. "It were him, sir," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Tall and thin as death itself, with eyes like burning coals. I seen him standing there by the lamp-post, watching the shop." "Describe him further," Holmes urged. She shook her head. "A pale gentleman, sir, pale as the grave. When I looked again, he were gone." Others muttered similar tales. A figure glimpsed in the fog, spectral, silent, vanishing at the approach of any honest soul. I felt a chill deeper than the river mist as I listened, for each account bore a dreadful resemblance to the man I had once seen struggle with Holmes at Reichenbach, the man whose body should have been dashed to pieces upon the rocks below. "Surely, Holmes," I murmured, "this is but the fevered imagination of frightened witnesses." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Fear sharpens perception, Watson, though it also distorts. These people believe they have seen a ghost. I contend they have seen something far more dangerous, a man who knows precisely how to cloak himself in Moriarty's likeness." His words hung in the damp air, and the murmurs of the crowd seemed to deepen, as though the very streets themselves whispered the professor's name. Holmes, ever restless in his examination, moved behind the counter and began sifting through the debris with the tip of his cane. His eyes darted from one corner to another until, with a sudden movement, he thrust his hand beneath a pile of ledgers cast carelessly aside. When he drew it forth, a small leather-bound book, cracked and weather-stained, lay in his grasp. "This," he murmured, "is of far greater value than the gold trinkets scattered upon the floor." He opened it upon the counter, and I leaned over his shoulder. The pages were filled with names, scores of them, each written in a precise cold hand. Dates, sums of money, and cryptic notations trailed beside them. Some of the names I recalled from past cases, men whose villainy Holmes had exposed, criminals who had served their sentences and disappeared into the darker alleys of London. Holmes tapped one entry with his long forefinger. "Note it well, Watson. Released from Dartmoor 3 weeks past. Another from Pentonville but 5 days ago. And here, yet another. A gang of the professor's old lieutenants, one by one, returning to the streets." A grim understanding dawned on me. "Then this is no random murder, Holmes. It is a gathering of the old web." He closed the ledger with a sharp snap. "Precisely. The professor built an empire of minds and men. Empires may crumble, Watson, but their foundations remain, awaiting only the architect or his disciple to raise them anew." As we stepped once more into the street, the fog clung heavier, as though it too conspired to veil the city in secrecy. The murmuring crowd had dispersed, leaving only the echo of their whispers lingering in the damp air. I walked beside Holmes in silence, yet my mind churned with dread. It seemed to me that the very stones of London bore the professor's mark, as though his malignant intellect had seeped into the alleys, the warehouses, the hidden dens along the river. Though his body had long since been dashed upon the rocks of Reichenbach, the thought of him, the legend of his cunning, still commanded obedience and fear. I could not prevent a shiver from running through me. "Holmes," I said quietly, "is it possible that we are fighting not a man, but an idea, something that lives beyond the grave?" He turned his sharp gaze upon me, and for a moment his face softened. "Your instinct, my dear Watson, touches the heart of the matter. Evil, once set loose, casts a shadow longer than the life of its master. And yet, let us not surrender to superstition. There is a hand at work here, guided by reason, malignant reason, but reason nonetheless. We must uncover it." His words steadied me somewhat, though they did little to ease the growing conviction that Moriarty's empire had never truly died. Holmes requested a lamp from the constable, and together we descended into the narrow cellar beneath the jeweller's shop. The air was foul with mildew, and the low ceiling forced us to stoop as we moved among the barrels and crates. The flame flickered, casting monstrous shadows upon the walls. Holmes paused suddenly, raising the lamp. There, scrawled in white across the damp bricks, was a symbol I recognized with a chill. It was nothing to the untrained eye, a simple pattern of intersecting lines. But to those acquainted with the professor's methods, it was unmistakable. "Moriarty's code," Holmes whispered, freshly drawn. My heart sank. "Then he lives—" "No," Holmes cut me short, his voice sharp. "Not he, but one who has studied his hand with slavish devotion. See here, the angle of the stroke, the hesitation in the curve. This is not Moriarty's own, but a careful imitation." Still, the effect upon me was no less dreadful. To stand in that cellar, with the damp dripping from the beams and the symbol of the dead professor staring from the wall, was to feel as though the man himself had risen to mock us. Holmes lowered the lamp, his face grave. "This is the proof we required, Watson. Moriarty's disciples have begun their work anew, and their message is clear. The professor's shadow yet commands the night." The words lingered like the echo of doom, and as we ascended once more into the fog-choked street, I could not rid myself of the sensation that eyes unseen were watching, waiting, weaving the web tighter about us. The days that followed our grim discovery in Limehouse deepened the shadow that had fallen upon London. Wherever Holmes and I ventured, we encountered whispers spoken in hushed voices, glances cast nervously over shoulders, and doors that closed swiftly at our approach. It seemed as though the very name of Moriarty had risen again to take the city captive, enslaving men not by chains, but by terror. In the narrow lanes of Whitechapel, I spoke with a costermonger who swore that he had seen the professor walking in the fog, his eyes gleaming like coals. Another, a cabman with trembling hands, insisted that his passenger vanished from the hansom as though into thin air. Their faces bore the pallor of true fear, and though their tales contradicted one another in detail, in one respect they were united. Each believed that the criminal genius we had seen perish at Reichenbach now walked once more upon the earth. I did my best to calm them, to assure them that such phantoms belonged only to nightmares, yet I confess my own heart was ill at ease. It seemed to me that London itself was sinking beneath a weight of dread, as though a malignant will pressed invisibly upon its streets. Holmes, however, heard their testimonies in silence, his lips compressed into a thin line. He noted each phrase, each quaver of voice, with the precision of one adding pieces to a puzzle, but his eyes betrayed no flicker of belief. The climax of these eerie reports came one mist-laden evening, when Holmes and I, summoned by an urgent message, found ourselves at the riverside. The fog clung thick along the Thames, so that the gas lamps flickered like dying stars in a sea of grey. A small crowd had gathered, their faces drawn with fear, all pointing towards the dark sweep of the river. "There, sir," cried one, a dockhand with wide, terrified eyes. "By the water's edge, I swear I saw him, the professor himself, white as death, watching us with that terrible gaze of his." I followed the line of his trembling finger, and for one dreadful moment I, too, thought I glimpsed a figure, a tall, gaunt shape, half concealed by the fog, its outline sharp against the faint shimmer of the water. It seemed to linger only long enough to fix us with its gaze before it melted back into the mist and was gone. A gasp rose from the onlookers, and some crossed themselves. One woman swooned outright, convinced that the devil himself had risen. The cry spread swiftly along the quay. "Moriarty! The professor walks again!" I felt my blood run cold. Though my reason rebelled, my senses could not wholly deny what I had seen. The apparition seemed too vivid, too deliberate, to be merely a trick of the fog. I turned to Holmes, my lips shaping the unspoken question. Holmes stood apart from the crowd, his lean figure rising sharp and unwavering against the swirl of mist. His face betrayed no fear, no astonishment, only that keen intensity which I had learned to recognize as the signal that his mind was at its most active. "Come, Watson," he said at last, his tone brisk, almost contemptuous. "You allow the Thames fog to play tricks upon your imagination. That which you and these good people have witnessed is no ghost but a man, flesh and blood, who has studied Moriarty's form with painstaking care." "But Holmes," I protested, lowering my voice, "the resemblance was uncanny. Even I, who stood with you at Reichenbach, felt the very air of the man in that fleeting shape." "Exactly," he returned, his eyes gleaming. "That is the design. Fear is the most obedient of servants. To conjure Moriarty from the grave requires no miracle, only artifice and timing. Our adversary would have the city believe the professor has returned. By that belief, he binds them in chains stronger than iron." He turned back to the crowd, his voice cutting through their murmurs. "Gentlemen, ladies, you have seen not the risen dead, but the cunning of the living. Remember that." Yet even as he spoke, I felt the unease linger in my breast. For though my reason clung to Holmes's explanation, my heart whispered that Moriarty's hand, whether spectral or earthly, was once more at work in London. That night, as we sat once more by the fire of Baker Street, I could not rid myself of the impression that Holmes himself bore some hidden wound. His face was pale, his eyes fixed upon the flames with a strange intensity, as though they conjured for him not warmth, but memories. "Moriarty," he murmured at last, scarcely above a whisper. It was not a declaration, but a thought escaping unbidden. I started, for rarely did Holmes speak so to himself. I studied him in silence, yet my heart grew heavy. I had seen him face death without a tremor, had watched him unmask villains of every shade, but never had I perceived such shadows pressing upon his countenance. It was as if the ghost that haunted London haunted him most keenly of all. Could it be, I wondered, that the memory of his old adversary weighed more heavily than he confessed? Had the struggle at Reichenbach left not merely scars of flesh, but scars of spirit? I longed to speak, to offer some word of reassurance, but Holmes turned suddenly, his eyes flashing with their old brilliance. "Do not be troubled, Watson," he said, reading my thought as easily as he read a page. "The shadow of the professor cannot master me, but it is a shadow nonetheless, and shadows must be pursued until the source of light is found." His words steadied me outwardly, but within I still felt the chill, for even Holmes could not wholly deny the darkness pressing upon him. The following days saw us drawn deeper into the labyrinth of London's underworld. Holmes, tireless in pursuit, traced faint whispers and obscure signs through taverns and alleys where the law seldom dared to tread. It was in one such den, reeking of gin and tobacco, that he bent close to me and murmured, "Note the pattern, Watson. The same men, once bound by Moriarty's command, are stirring again. But observe, there is a guiding hand among them, brilliant yet unseen." He showed me scraps of coded notes passed from one criminal to another, each bearing the unmistakable cadence of Moriarty's logic. And yet Holmes pointed out the subtle differences. A hesitation in the phrasing, a flourish where none had been before. "This is not the master himself," he declared, "but one who models himself upon the master, imitating, yet adapting. A disciple, Watson. A mind both ruthless and eager, determined not merely to preserve Moriarty's legacy, but to surpass it." The thought filled me with dread, for if Moriarty had been the Napoleon of crime, what monster might arise from one who idolized him with religious fervor? Holmes's face hardened. "We confront not a phantom, but a will of flesh and blood, one who seeks to weave himself into the legend until London cannot distinguish between the shadow and the man." It was on the third night of our inquiry that the dread truth burst upon us with cruel clarity. A constable, pale and breathless, arrived at Baker Street as the clock struck midnight. "There's been another, sir," he gasped. "A man found dead in Suffolk, and, God help us, he was one of Moriarty's own." We followed him at once, the hansom rattling through the sleeping city. In a narrow yard, lit by the wavering glow of lanterns, lay the crumpled form of a man I recognized at once from old police records, a henchman once trusted by the professor in his darker schemes. His throat had been cut with merciless precision, and his rigid hand still clutched an object, as though in final defiance. Holmes bent low, prying open the dead fingers with infinite care. There, gleaming in the lantern light, was a ring, identical in every detail to the one delivered to Baker Street, identical to the one taken from the murdered jeweller. Holmes straightened slowly, his face unreadable. The pattern completes itself, Watson. The rings are tokens, each bound to betrayal, each marking the steps of a deliberate campaign. A silence fell upon us all, broken only by the dripping of rain in the gutters. I felt the blood run cold in my veins, for here was proof undeniable that the conspiracy was no fancy, no illusion of frightened minds. The professor was dead, yet his hand, through another, still struck from the grave. The days that followed the second murder drew Holmes and me into the very heart of London's criminal labyrinth. It was as if some unseen hand pulled us steadily downward, past the respectable facades of the city into its foulest depths. We passed through alleys where the fog lay like a suffocating shroud, where broken shutters hung like dead limbs from the windows, and where the flicker of a lamp revealed faces quick to vanish into shadow. Taverns reeking of gin and desperation echoed with murmurs that ceased the moment we entered. In these quarters, the law seldom ventured. Yet here, Holmes moved with uncanny assurance, as though the darkness itself yielded its secrets to his gaze. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, as we passed a group of roughs, whispering in a doorway. "Their silence is too deliberate. Each knows something but fears to speak. Fear, you see, is the surest mark of organization, and organization, here, in the very quarter Moriarty once ruled, can belong to no ordinary criminal." At every turn, whispers of a hidden hand reached us, snatches of talk, coded gestures, fragments of gossip that, pieced together, suggested the presence of a mastermind, unseen yet omnipresent, orchestrating events with mathematical precision. The sense of being watched never left me. I felt the chill of eyes upon my back, even in the most crowded street. Holmes, however, thrived in the darkness. "The web tightens, Watson," he said, his voice low, "and if we are very still, we may yet glimpse the spider at its centre." It was in a squalid tavern by the river, its windows blackened with grime, that the proof of the mastermind's hand at last revealed itself. Holmes, having secured the cooperation of a reluctant informant with a sovereign discreetly pressed into his palm, was led to a crumpled sheet of paper, hidden behind a loose board near the hearth. He unfolded it with care, and the moment my eyes fell upon the writing, I felt my breath catch. The hand was elegant, precise, unmistakable. "Moriarty," I whispered. Holmes's expression did not change. He studied the letter for long minutes, his lips moving silently as he traced the peculiar flow of its script. At last he handed it to me. The message was brief, almost laconic. "The debt shall be paid. Prepare yourself. The circle closes." Every line bore the mark of the professor's style, those cold, measured strokes I had once seen in the records of Scotland Yard. And yet, Holmes's keen gaze detected what my eyes could not. "Look closer, Watson," he said. "Note the curvature of the P, the slight hesitation before the final flourish. It is an imitation, exquisite, but flawed. Our adversary is a pupil, talented, yes, but not the master. Still, his intent is clear. To revive not merely Moriarty's work, but his very presence." I shivered, for the deception was near perfect. To the untrained eye, the professor himself had written those words. A hand reaching from the grave to claim vengeance. Holmes folded the letter with deliberate care. "He declares himself, Watson. Revenge is his cry, and the circle is his snare." We had scarcely left the tavern when the snare was sprung. The fog pressed thick against the alley, as Holmes led the way, his stride swift, his senses sharpened to the unseen. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the gloom. A glint of steel flashed in the lamplight. "Holmes!" I cried. A figure lunged from the darkness, a blade arcing toward my companion's breast. Holmes twisted aside with astonishing swiftness, but another shape emerged behind him, raising a club. In that instant, instinct overcame fear. I hurled myself forward, striking the man aside, the weapon clattering harmlessly to the ground. Holmes had already disarmed the first assailant, his long fingers gripping the man's wrist with iron strength, forcing the knife to the stones. The clash was brief but fierce, until both attackers wrenched free and vanished into the fog with a speed that bespoke premeditation. Holmes straightened, his breath calm, though his eyes burned with the fire of pursuit denied. "You see, Watson, they expected me. This was no chance encounter. They seek not to spread fear indiscriminately, but to remove me from the board altogether." My heart pounded with the nearness of death, yet his words chilled me more than the blade. For the first time, I understood that we were not merely unraveling a mystery. We were hunted prey within it. Holmes glanced toward the fog where our assailants had vanished. "The game hastens toward its climax," he said. "But the fact that they struck openly tonight reveals desperation. The spider grows impatient." Holmes and I returned to Baker Street in silence, the fog clinging to our coats like some malignant parasite. He strode directly to his desk, spread out the scraps of evidence we had gathered, fragments of notes, whispered testimonies, half-heard threats, and arranged them with the precision of a man aligning pieces upon a chessboard. I watched in fascination as his long, nervous fingers traced invisible lines from one clue to another. His eyes shone with an almost feverish brilliance. "Watson," he said at last, "you will observe that each act we have encountered, the ring, the murder of the jeweller, the apparition by the Thames, the second killing, was not isolated but carefully staged. These are not random strokes of malice, but deliberate moves upon a board of my adversary's design." He leaned forward, tapping the coded letter with his forefinger. "See the progression. First, the relic of Moriarty to awaken memory. Second, blood to inspire fear. Third, the ghostly guise of the professor to sow confusion. Fourth, an ambush directed at me alone. Each step draws the circle closer, each calculated to leave but one conclusion. The final target is Sherlock Holmes." His tone was measured, almost cold, but beneath it I sensed a tension that unsettled me deeply. He spoke not as one detached from danger, but as a man who knew the jaws of the trap were closing. "And Watson," he added quietly, "the trap is elegant, so elegant that I must admire it, even as it seeks to end me." It was not until the small hours, when Holmes at last took to his violin, that I allowed myself to reckon with the weight pressing upon me. The strains of his bow, low and sombre, filled the sitting room with a melancholy that seemed less music than lament. I sat in my chair, watching the shadows twist upon the walls, and felt a dread I could scarcely master. Never had I seen Holmes so closely matched, so deliberately pursued by a mind intent not merely upon crime, but upon his destruction. I recalled Reichenbach, the struggle upon the precipice, and shuddered to think that perhaps fate had spared the professor only to return his vengeance through another hand. What if Holmes had indeed met his equal? What if, despite all his brilliance, he were drawn at last into a snare from which there was no escape? The thought gnawed at me until I could bear it no longer. "Holmes," I said, my voice low, "you speak of traps and circles as though you admire them, but God forgive me, I fear that you have found in this adversary one who may best you." He lowered the violin, regarding me with eyes both stern and compassionate. "Fear is natural, Watson, but it clouds judgment. Remember this, every snare is woven of threads, and every thread can be traced to its source. So long as I breathe, the professor's legacy shall not prevail. That is my pledge." Though his words steadied me, I could not wholly banish the dread that weighed upon my heart. Dawn had scarcely begun to pale the eastern sky when the bell at Baker Street clanged violently, startling us both from uneasy rest. Mrs. Hudson brought in a plain envelope, her hand trembling as though she felt the chill of its contents before ever it was opened. Holmes slit it with his knife and unfolded the single sheet within. His eyes scanned it swiftly, his face as unreadable as stone. At last he passed it to me without a word. Upon the paper, in the same elegant, precise hand that had mimicked Moriarty before, were 6 words only. "At dawn, the last debt will be paid." The letters seemed to bleed upon the page, stark and pitiless. A hush fell over the room, broken only by the faint rattle of rain upon the panes. Holmes stood motionless, then placed the note carefully upon the mantel beside the ring and the box that had begun this dreadful chain. "The hour approaches, Watson," he said quietly. "We stand upon the brink. Our adversary declares his intention openly. He will strike at dawn." A shiver passed through me, for dawn was but hours away. The city lay sleeping, ignorant of the peril that drew ever closer, while in our sitting room at Baker Street I felt the very air thicken with the weight of an unseen doom. It was in the hour before, dawn, when London lay hushed beneath the weight of its own shadows, that Holmes led me across the deserted expanse of Blackfriars Bridge. The river churned darkly below, its black waters whispering against the piers as though in secret council. A single lamp burned faintly on the far side, casting a sickly halo upon the mist, and beyond it yawned the entrance to the abandoned tunnels, those long-forgotten arteries beneath the city through which smugglers and fugitives once moved unseen. Holmes carried a lantern, its glow throwing grotesque shapes upon the dripping stone as we descended the worn steps. The air grew damp and foul, heavy with the stench of mildew and stagnant water. Each footfall echoed like a warning, and I confess that my heart thudded with a dread I could not disguise. "Holmes," I whispered, "what if this is but another snare?" He did not turn. "It is a snare, Watson, but it is one we must enter, for only within its coils shall we find the hand that tightens it." The tunnel stretched before us, like the throat of some monstrous beast, narrowing into darkness. Somewhere within, I fancied I heard the faint scrape of a boot upon stone. The lantern's light flickered, as if reluctant to go further. Yet Holmes pressed on, his stride steady, his eyes gleaming with grim resolve. At last, the tunnel widened into a cavernous chamber, its vaulted ceiling dripping steadily, its walls scarred with marks of age. And there, waiting in the half-light, stood a solitary figure. He was tall and spare, his frame angular as though carved from shadow, his face pale with the sickly sheen of one who had lived long in confinement of body or spirit. Yet his eyes, cold, calculating, and merciless, betrayed a ferocity that chilled me more than the dank air. "You are late, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice precise, measured, and utterly devoid of warmth. But then, the master always said you were fond of dramatic timing. Holmes raised the lantern, the light striking full upon the man's features. There was no mistaking the intellect etched into that gaunt visage, nor the arrogance that curled his lips. He was younger than Moriarty, yet his bearing mirrored the professor's with dreadful exactness. "A mathematician," Holmes observed, his tone sharp as a blade. "Your speech betrays the training, and your hands, the ink stains, speak of formulae more often than tools. You were his student, his disciple." The man's lips curved into a mirthless smile. "I was more than that, Holmes. I was his heir. When he fell at Reichenbach, I alone understood the full scope of his designs. I alone had the will to preserve them." "You mean to pervert them," Holmes replied coldly. "You wield his name as a weapon, but you are no Moriarty. You are a shadow cast by his flame." The disciple's eyes gleamed with something perilously close to madness. And yet it is the shadow that endures. Tonight, you will learn that the Professor lives on, not in blood, but in me. Holmes advanced a pace, his gaze unwavering, his voice steady as he spoke. The rings, then, tokens of your design, each placed with deliberate care, each a symbol. You chose them not as trinkets, but as instruments of fear. The disciple inclined his head, almost in admiration. Indeed, Dr. Watson may record this much. Each ring bore the memory of betrayal, the jeweler who once cheated the master in secret, the henchman who abandoned him in his hour of need. Each was marked, each was punished. And you, Holmes, you who cast him into the abyss, yours was the first ring. The word struck me with the chill of iron. I turned to Holmes, but he remained composed, his eyes fixed upon the pale mathematician. You employ psychology as your dagger, Holmes said softly. You seek not only to slay, but to unnerve, to awaken the dead in the minds of the living. An imitation of Moriarty's genius, but crude, for where he moved in silence, you brandish theatrics. Where he commanded loyalty, you inspire only terror. The man's calm faltered, if only for an instant. His lips thinned, his fingers flexed at his side. You are clever, Holmes, he hissed, but not clever enough to halt what has begun. The debt will be settled, the legend restored, and London will tremble anew at the name Moriarty. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Then let us finish this game, for dawn approaches, and your circle closes not upon me, but upon yourself. The echo of his words shivered through the cavern, and in that moment I knew the confrontation had only just begun. The pale mathematician advanced a step, his cold gaze fixed upon Holmes. His lips curved into what might have been a smile, though it carried nothing of warmth. You think yourself master of the board, Holmes, he said, his voice ringing sharply against the damp stone walls. But the pieces move at my command now. Holmes inclined his head slightly, his manner as calm as though he stood before a blackboard rather than a sworn disciple of the late professor. Indeed? Then let us test the claim. What followed was not a clash of weapons, but of intellect, each word and gesture measured as though in a deadly game of chess. The disciple fainted with threats of hidden accomplices, of unseen blades poised in the dark. Holmes countered at once, dismantling each bluff by citing the precise intervals of sound, the absence of footsteps, the too perfect stillness in the chamber. You would have us believe your forces lurk in every corner, Holmes declared. Yet the echo betrays you. The chamber is empty. Your allies, if they exist, have abandoned you to play your last move alone. The disciple's eyes narrowed, but he pressed another gambit. He claimed to hold knowledge of Scotland Yard's own vulnerabilities, of officers turned traitor. Holmes struck back with surgical precision, naming those very men already accounted for, already under lock and guard by Lestrade himself. With each turn, the disciple's composure faltered, his lips thinning, his hands twitching. Holmes anticipated every calculation, exposed every false line of reasoning, until at last he spoke the words that left his adversary stricken. You sought to mimic Moriarty's genius, but you mistook cruelty for brilliance. The professor built an empire of silence. You build a spectacle of fear. That is why you have already lost. The pale man's chest heaved as he struggled to hold his mask of superiority. Yet Holmes pressed forward, his voice quiet, relentless. You have staged murders to terrorize, planted rings as symbols of betrayal, and wrapped yourself in the professor's shadow. But fear, like fog, disperses in the light of day. All that remains is the truth. You are a disciple, not a master, and your web is already torn. At that very instant, the echo of boots resounded through the tunnel. From the far end of the chamber, lanterns flared, and the unmistakable voice of Inspector Lestrade rang out, "Holmes, we have the exits secured." The disciple's head whipped round, his pallor deepening. The trap that he had woven so carefully now closed about himself. Holmes, unflinching, stepped closer. "Your greatest miscalculation," he said, "was to treat London as a stage upon which you might parade Moriarty's ghost. But the city is not an audience, it is a witness. Every witness leaves a trail, and I have followed each until they led me here. You are undone by your own theatre." The man gave a strangled cry, his composure finally shattered. He struck out in desperation, but Holmes caught his wrist with lightning speed. The lantern light flared across his twisted features as Lestrade's men surged forward, wresting him into irons. Even then, his lips quivered with defiance. "You think you have won, Holmes," he hissed, "but you have merely taken a pawn. The game, the true game, has only begun." The disciple was dragged away, his cries echoing into the tunnels until silence reclaimed the chamber. I exhaled at last, scarcely aware I had been holding my breath. Holmes remained motionless, his gaze fixed upon the darkness where the man had stood. "Watson," he murmured, "the most dangerous foe is not the one who strikes, but the one who prepares the blow long before the hand is raised. We have ended one thread tonight, but the fabric remains." Lestrade approached, holding out a small object taken from the prisoner's coat. "Found this on him, Mr. Holmes. Looks like it was meant for you." Holmes accepted it without reply. It was an envelope, yellowed with age, the paper brittle yet intact, and upon its fold lay a wax seal, blood red, pressed with the unmistakable crest I had seen once before among the professor's effects. "Moriarty," I whispered, my throat dry. Holmes broke the seal with delicate precision and unfolded the sheet. His eyes moved swiftly across the page, and though his expression betrayed little, I saw his hand tighten ever so slightly upon the parchment. He said nothing at first, but I caught a glimpse of the words, lines written in the professor's own hand, dated before his fall at Reichenbach. It was not a confession, nor a plan, but a message, a promise that his work would outlive him, entrusted to one who bore the patience to continue. Holmes folded the letter with grim care and placed it back into the envelope. He set it upon the stone ledge beside the dying lantern. "The professor is dead," he said quietly, "but his shadow was never buried. We have not slain the ghost, Watson. We have only touched the hem of it." As dawn's pale light seeped faintly through the cracks above, I felt no triumph, only a chill certainty that the struggle which began at Reichenbach had not ended there, and that Moriarty's hand, cold, calculating, eternal, still reached across London. The dawn that followed our descent beneath Blackfriars Bridge broke pale and hollow, as though the very sun had wearied of London's shadows. The disciple had been carried off in irons, yet the air seemed no lighter. A strange hush lingered over the city, and I could not shake the feeling that the mist itself held its breath. The people, when word of the arrest spread, received it with mingled relief and dread. Some proclaimed that the terror was ended, that Moriarty's shadow had at last been dispelled. Yet others, more cautious, glanced uneasily at the fog-bound streets, as though fearing to glimpse that tall, spectral figure again. Holmes, for his part, spoke little. He strode beside me through the grey streets with the air of a man whose thoughts weighed heavier than the chains upon the captive we had delivered. There was no exultation in him, no triumph. His eyes, sharp and restless, turned often to the river, as though searching for something that remained unseen. For myself, I felt the weariness of battle fought in darkness. Yet even in our moment of reprieve, unease gnawed at me. I could not shake the sense that London was not freed, only quieted, as if the storm had paused, not passed. That evening, in our familiar sitting room at Baker Street, I pressed Holmes to speak. He stood by the hearth, the glow of the fire casting his features into stark relief, his violin resting untouched upon the chair beside him. "At last, Holmes," I said, "you must tell me plainly. What was this web into which we were drawn?" He inclined his head slightly, and his eyes gleamed with that cold clarity which I had come to recognize as the very essence of his genius. "The disciple," he began, sought not merely to continue Moriarty's crimes, but to revive his legend. The rings, Watson, were his instrument, tokens of memory and fear, each bound to betrayal among the professor's circle. The jeweller who wronged him, the henchman who abandoned him, each struck down as an example. And with each, murder. The illusion grew that Moriarty himself had risen. He paced the rug, his hands clasped behind his back. It was an edifice built upon psychology, not power. Fear was his scaffolding, but like all illusions, it falters beneath scrutiny. He overreached, drew too much attention, and in his eagerness to mimic the master, betrayed his own limitations. Holmes paused, his gaze distant. Yet the peril lay not in his crimes, but in his idea. For men may be slain, Watson, but ideas, especially those born of genius, cling to the world long after their creator has fallen. Holmes fell silent then, and for a long moment the crackle of the fire was the only sound. At last I ventured to speak of the letter, the one sealed in that dreadful red wax which had so chilled me when first I beheld it. Holmes drew it from his desk with deliberate care and placed it upon the table between us. The seal, though broken, still bore the crest that had once marked Moriarty's own hand. "You feared it was an imitation," I whispered. "Tell me it was." Holmes's face darkened. "It was not. The seal is genuine." A silence fell heavy in the room. I stared at him, scarcely comprehending. "Then Moriarty himself prepared it." "Before Reichenbach," Holmes said gravely. "The professor was no ordinary criminal. He was a strategist of uncanny foresight. He anticipated the possibility of his fall and left tokens behind, messages entrusted to disciples such as the man we unmasked. He prepared his shadow as carefully as his empire. The weight of his words pressed upon me like the gloom of the fog outside. Even in death, Moriarty had contrived to reach across the years, to leave behind the impression of immortality. Holmes rested his hand upon the envelope, his eyes glinting in the firelight. "Understand this, Watson. We may have subdued his disciple, but we have not buried the professor's spectre. So long as men seek power through fear, his ideas will rise again." I felt a shiver course through me, for in that moment I knew Holmes was right. The man had perished at Reichenbach, but his shadow yet moved across London, silent, persistent, and unyielding. And as I closed my notes upon that dreadful case, I could not help but write the final truth that haunted me still. The professor may have fallen, but his legacy endures, etched in fear, sealed in wax, and glinting in the shadows like a ring that will never fade. Holmes sat long in silence after revealing the truth of the seal, his lean figure half lit by the firelight, his shadow stretching across the floorboards like some dark spectre of its own. At length he rose, his hands clasped behind his back, and spoke with a gravity that chilled me more than any cry of alarm could have done. "Men perish, Watson," he said, his voice low yet clear, "but their ideas do not. They cling to the world long after the body has turned to dust. The professor is gone. Of that there can be no doubt. But his mind, his schemes, his very method of wielding fear as a weapon, these live on in those willing to embrace them. That is why his shadow persists, not in form, but in the echo of his thought." He turned toward the window, where the fog pressed thick against the glass. "It is not the man we battle now, but the contagion of his genius. That contagion spreads when men of lesser mind take it up and wield it with crude hands, as our pale mathematicians sought to do. They are dangerous not for their brilliance, but for their devotion." His words fell heavy, and I felt anew the truth of them, for it seemed to me that the greater peril lay not in one master criminal, but in the countless shadows cast by his memory. That night, long after Holmes had taken himself to bed, I sat alone with my journal, my pen trembling as I sought to capture the enormity of what we had endured. The fire had burned low, the coals glowing faintly, casting the room into an uneasy half-light. And still, though I knew Moriarty had perished years before, his presence pressed upon me with suffocating weight. It is one thing to face a living foe, however brilliant, and to know that he may be struck down. It is another to face a name, a legend, a shadow that lingers long after the man himself has fallen. That shadow can haunt a city, warp men's minds, and turn even the strongest into trembling victims of fear. I found myself confessing in my notes what I dared not say aloud, that Moriarty's name chilled me more than any living adversary we had ever faced. For even in triumph, I could not shake the dread that he remained among us, not in flesh, but in memory, in whispers, in the secrets men pass in darkened alleys. The disciple had fallen, his web torn apart by Holmes's keen deductions, and yet I felt no victory. Instead, I felt the cold hand of something unfinished, a war fought not against a man but against the very idea of him. As I set down my pen, my gaze fell upon the small drawer of Holmes's desk. It was there he had placed the ring, the golden band that had begun this dreadful chain of events. I knew it rested there still, locked away, yet the thought of it made my blood run cold. The lamp upon the table flickered, and in that wavering light I fancied I saw the drawer glint faintly, as though the ring within caught the glow and returned it with a sinister gleam. I could almost imagine the professor's eyes staring back at us through that glint, calm, calculating, waiting. Holmes had dismissed it as an object, a token stripped of its power. Yet to me it seemed alive, a relic not merely of metal, but of menace. It was as if the ring itself carried the professor's will, biding its time until some other disciple should take it up again. I closed my notes with a shudder, and as I did, Holmes's words returned to me with terrible clarity. Men perish, but their ideas endure. And so I ended my account with the image that shall forever haunt me, the ring lying in silence, hidden yet glinting faintly in the drawer at Baker Street, as though Moriarty still watched us from the grave, his shadow stretching unbroken across the streets of London. Holmes sat by the fire, the faint gleam of the ring now locked away in his drawer catching his eye. "You see, Watson," he said quietly, "men may perish at waterfalls or gallows, but their ideas linger. It is not the hand that haunts us, but the thought it once wielded. That is why Moriarty's shadow remains, because fear, once sown, grows in the minds of men. And now I put the question to you. What do you believe was the disciple's gravest miscalculation? His ambition to mimic the master, or his belief that fear alone could rule? Share your thoughts below, and if you enjoyed this case, do remember to comment, subscribe, and share it with those who, like us, never tire of following Holmes into the fog of mystery.